DLC in fighting games is inevitable. The practice of adding onto a game's roster post-launch has become so normalized and expected that people start talking about and predicting what characters might show up before the full game has even been released. There's always been a sense of wonder in speculating and predicting which of your favorite characters will make it into the roster of a cool new fighting game. This calls back to the old days, before the internet, where you wouldn't always know exactly who was in a game before buying it. And of course, many games had unlockable characters that added even more to that sense of wonder. The feeling of playing the Subspace Emissary mode in Smash Brawl as a kid, with all these insanely cool characters being revealed gradually throughout the story mode, and then immediately unlocking them as soon as you encounter them, was a euphoric feeling to say the least. These days, unlockable characters are largely a thing of the past. And oh my god, putting secret characters in fighting games that people have to discover themselves? No way. Social media is just too huge, and these companies benefit far too much from just revealing everything before the game releases as marketing. They have no reason not to. Because of this, a lot of the magic around fighting game rosters has honestly been lost. That was until DLC. DLC characters are an absolutely genius addition to these type of games. It allows you to continue updating and adding content to your game periodically, thus keeping your community engaged, while also drawing in plenty of new fans through the mass hype culture surrounding it. Developers get to make a crazy amount of money long after the game releases, selling characters at pretty ridiculous markups, and we just eat it all up. Outsiders looking in might think it's kind of insane for people to be flipping out over a trailer for a returning DLC character that they then have to pay $10 for, but to us, these are everything. DLC reveals are some of the hypest moments in all of fighting games. Unfortunately, it doesn't always end up going down so smoothly. This is still a relatively new practice, and a ton of issues have inherently surfaced throughout this whole process. Many complain about the prices of DLC. The idea that serious players are essentially forced to spend hundreds of extra dollars on characters just to be able to lab and beat them is definitely a valid complaint. Tournament organizers, and by extension, the generous communities around them who provide setups for big tournaments, also have to shell out this money for each person's copy of the game. It's definitely a big new expense. There's also always been talks of predatory practices, like purposely leaving out base game content just to make super easy profit later. This has plagued the FGC throughout the years, with infamous examples like Street Fighter X Tekken, where it was revealed that 12 additional characters were ready at launch, but were purposely kept out of the game just to sell back to us later. There's definitely a lot of potential issues here. What happens when fan-favorite characters start getting purposely left out of a game's roster? Because greedy developers know they can sell it back to you at an insane profit. What happens when they start doing this for multiple games in a row? What happens when developers realize intentionally making the paid characters cooler and significantly stronger than the regular free characters significantly boosts sales? Fighting game DLC has been so normalized that most people don't ever think about these things. All the potential issues DLC can cause for a fighting game when not implemented properly. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Tekken 7, one of the most successful fighting games of all time, and seeing what we can learn through looking at its over 4 years of character updates. Why do some people say this game was pay to win? Why do others still claim there's huge issues with how DLC was handled in this game, and even still in Tekken 8? We're going to be answering all of this. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new, and let's get into it. Tekken 7 was the first ever Tekken game to feature paid DLC. While Tekken Tag 2 had free additional characters, and Tekken Revolution tried and failed at monetizing its players, Tekken 7 took the standard approach we all know today, releasing multiple seasons of DLC, adding a total of 15 characters throughout its lifespan. With the first additional character being revealed 6 months before the game came out. In January of 2017, a trailer revealing Eliza, the brand new character that joined the series in Tekken Revolution, through a public community poll, asking which concept Tekken fans would like to see in the next original character. Of course, you guys chose female vampire, and sexy female Tekken Force was second place. I know what you guys are. All jokes aside, Eliza was finally making it into a mainline Tekken game. Pretty cool. But why wasn't she in the main roster? If they had a full trailer ready for her 6 months before the game came out, I think it's quite obvious they worked on her alongside the base game. Normally, this would be a pretty shady practice, though it wasn't nearly as much of an issue because she was given out for free to anyone who pre-ordered the game. Still, this only served to punish people who didn't buy the game at launch, which, if you look at the data, ended up being around 99% of Tekken 7's player base. Even years later, people were paying for a character that was developed alongside the main game. Okay, whatever, not the greatest look, but it's fine. What is a big deal, however, is the precedent that Eliza set. Most people who play fighting games don't care that much about winning. The average casual isn't watching their own replays to try and improve, and they certainly aren't labbing characters to learn how to beat them. Casuals are not doing this. But the core fan base, the ones who watch tier lists and big tournaments, play ranked, and maybe occasionally go to tournaments of their own, were insanely punished by the addition of any DLC to Tekken. See, Tekken is by far the most lab-heavy fighting game currently in existence. Its core identity comes down to character knowledge, while other fighting games like Street Fighter allow you to play a more systemic game, where the characters are mostly just an extension of the fundamental gameplay and its systems. Tekken is not like this. Tekken is a game based on characters first and foremost. Each character is drastically different, and because the average Tekken character has over 100 moves, learning matchups is more crucial in this game than any other. The reality is, not all characters are made equal in the series. Let's look at Kazuya for example. Despite how difficult he is to play, he's at his core a very simple character. He wants to knock you down and make you guess as you get up to your feet. Funny hell sweep or funny mid kick that takes away all your HP. I'm obviously drastically oversimplifying it, but I feel like you could explain to the average player what his game plan is, and some simple counterplay to make dealing with him easier, pretty quickly. If you're struggling with the 50-50 he's known for, a simple sidestep to the left will beat both options. There's a lot of general counterplay you can learn without labbing the character. Okay, now let's look at Eddie Gordo. How are you possibly going to explain to someone how to go about fighting him? I guess you could just boil it down to breakdancer, capoeira, mix up, mix up, mix up. But this guy isn't mixing you up with a simple hell sweep and a mid launcher. No, he's mixing you up every single second of the match. He's using string after string, going into stance after stance. He'll hit your block 5 times, and then when you do press, we'll throw in a counter hit launcher and blow you up. I'm sure there'll be at least a few Eddie players coping in the comments, but I'm sorry, this is the reality. Eddie is one of those characters who you essentially cannot beat unless you lab the character. You need to play him for yourself and figure out how he works, which moves he's consistently using, and how to deal with each one. Okay, so what happens when Eddie Gordo becomes a DLC character? Here in Canada, one Tekken 8 DLC character costs $11. So if I want to give myself a reasonable chance at beating an Eddie Gordo player, I need to pay $11? If you're lucky, there'll be some free resources on YouTube, but watching a video showing you how to do it and actually practicing it for yourself are two very, very different things. It of course doesn't help that the characters in Tekken who tend to require the most labbing to beat are often the ones that are incredibly unpopular, meaning you don't run into them often playing online. This is why the most popular characters tend to have lower win rates in fighting games. Characters like Kazuya and Jin just appear so often that you can get a really good feel for fighting them, even without spending any time labbing them. What happens when the DLC characters of a Tekken game are these so-called lab characters, and are incredibly uncommon? Well, when this happens, you get Eliza. Listen, I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes here. I'm sure there's plenty of people who like Eliza, but if we're being honest, she was one of the most uniquely frustrating characters to ever deal with back in Tekken 7. Eliza is a 2D character, just like Akuma. This means she fundamentally breaks almost every rule of Tekken. She has a 2D meter that she builds up throughout the match, a Hadouken, the Street Fighter EXDP being a frame 1 invincible reversal. No other character in Tekken can do this, by the way. She can special cancel her moves, and most importantly, she can jump. Tekken characters just do not jump. It's never been a thing, as all of these characters' jumps and moves in the air are designed around being incredibly sluggish and slow, completely unviable, unless you're a 2D character. Her, Akuma, and Geese are the only characters in Tekken history who have a Street Fighter style jump. This is problematic because, unlike in Street Fighter, DPs, or any form of traditional anti-air, simply do not exist. They just don't, making jumping on these characters ridiculously strong. In standard Tekken, if you want to defend, you either backdash or sidestep to avoid moves. These 2D characters introduce a whole new dimension of movement, where they can jump over moves, taking very little risk themselves, and landing with either huge plus on block moves, or hitting you and getting a full 100 damage combo. With this being said so far, do you see why Eliza is probably going to be a character that needs to be labbed by anyone who's even remotely serious about the game? Even if you've been playing Tekken your whole life, you aren't going to know how to deal with a +6 on block dive kick at the wall that she's just spamming. She's canceling every single one of her crouch jabs into specials, and again, let I remind you, special canceling is not a thing in Tekken. No one else has anything like this. If she has meter, she can wall splat you from a 15 frame unreactable low, she can launch you from a 10 frame jab, and it's like, what is going on here? I don't know what game Eliza is playing, but it's certainly not Tekken. Despite all of this so far, I'm not even remotely talking about a character viability. Yet. Eliza wasn't considered the top tier, and she was actually considered the bottom to mid tier for most of the game's life. But does that matter? Does her viability matter when you have absolutely no idea what she's doing? If you want to learn the counterplay, you better have hoped you pre-ordered, or you're going to be forced to shell out money. She's also the second least common character in the game. You are simply not going to learn how to beat her through any other means. Running into her online will happen maybe once every couple weeks. For me, it was about once every month to 2 months. Unless you find a friend who already has the character and is willing to sit down with you and teach you everything, you're just not learning this matchup. This problem of locking labbing behind a paywall exists in all fighting games, of course, but it's not nearly as egregious in any other game. If you struggle with a DLC character in Street Fighter, you can at least rest easy knowing that, at most, the character will have like 10 moves, not 100. And that character probably won't be playing a completely different game than everything you've ever learned. When a Tekken character gets added to Street Fighter who can sidestep, then we'll start talking about Street Fighter's problems. This just isn't a thing. So, does this mean you have an inherent advantage over others when you buy Eliza? Well, unless you're in the top 8 of EVO, if you ask me, absolutely. She's not pay to win because of how broken and easy she is, and she's not even pay to win because of her game-breaking 2D mechanics. Akuma already exists in the base game. You never have to pay for him. So if you want a character with all the broken attributes Eliza has, you don't have to pay. However, the argument could absolutely be made that she is pay to win because of the combination of being a lab character, of which there are plenty in the base roster, don't get me wrong, but also a paid character, and also the second least popular character in the game. Every time you run into this character online, if you don't have the character, you're just going to be put at such an immediate disadvantage. So this is going to be our first potentially pay-to-win archetype. I'm going to call it the Labber Paywall. Unfortunately, however, Eliza is just the tip of the iceberg. We have plenty more ridiculous examples to look at today. The next DLC character that joined the roster was Geese Howard, and come on. Do I really need to say anything else? Full transparency here. I love Geese. My whole channel is based on Terry, so I'm a really big fan of the SNK characters. I loved his inclusion and really enjoyed playing him. And I gotta say, I miss him in Tekken 8, but I would be lying to you if I didn't say this right here and right now. He is absolute bullshit. Just like Eliza and Akuma, he's a 2D character, so everything I just mentioned about the goth girl vampire applies to Geese. Projectiles, jumps, special cancels, 10-frame launcher, the whole 9 yards. What doesn't apply to Eliza, however, is his modern Tekken privilege. See, Akuma was undeniably broken, easily the best character in the game, but there was a reason he was so unpopular in ranked and in tournament play. He's an incredibly difficult character, one of the most technically demanding in series history. He was broken, but you had to work for it. He also was unlike any other character in Tekken. He played very differently. Eliza was also considered very difficult, but was still seen as pretty weak in the tier lists. Geese didn't have any of these worries. He could still kill you in one combo, but he was significantly easier, and I say this as someone who mained Geese for a few years. You can figure this out pretty easily just by looking at competitive play. He was light years more popular. We even saw tons of pro players using him as a secondary. Did you ever see anyone use Akuma as a secondary in Tekken 7? Of course not. Secondaries are almost always simpler characters, as you're naturally not able to dedicate nearly as much time to a secondary as your main. Lots of people pick up easy top tiers to cover bad matchups all the time in tournament play, and Geese Howard was surprisingly common considering he was a 2D DLC character. Now, if we want to talk about difficulty to effectiveness ratio, he is nowhere close to some of the other characters we'll talk about in this video. He's absolutely more difficult than the average Tekken character. But the reality is, his barrier to entry was quite a bit lower than the other two. He might not have been quite as strong as Akuma in the end, but if you could pick him up in half the time, he becomes way more viable at a tournament level. And did I mention, Geese was stupidly broken. If you want to talk about pay-to-win characters, Geese is absolutely up there. He wasn't as complicated as Eliza, and I wouldn't consider him to be nearly as much of a lab character compared to her, but he would make up for it by being stupidly overpowered. What other character is hitting a mid parry on a safe mid poke and then doing a 0 to death combo? He had the best wall travel in the game. No matter where he was, if he had meter, he was getting you to the wall and was doing around 100 to 120 damage. Is this not a little bit excessive? He broke all the rules of Tekken by nature of being a 2D character, but unlike the others, was also very effective at playing regular Tekken. He had a great set of normals, and initially had a great 50-50 as well. meaning he's not nearly as big of a departure from standard Tekken playstyles. You could play him very fundamentally if you wanted to, meaning a pro player picking up Geese wasn't nearly as big of a jump as picking up Akuma. You could understand him quite easily. But of course, again, he also had all the stupid 2D cheese and privilege that comes with his $8 price tag. You could essentially pay for a significantly easier version of Akuma, the character who already broke Tekken in almost every way. Could this not be seen as a clear competitive advantage? I'll let you guys decide for yourself as we move on to the next character, Noctis. Oh god. Noctis takes us quite a bit further down the iceberg. I have some pretty serious issues with him. I actually made a whole separate video on him if you're interested, where I'll go into much further detail. Noctis, like Geese, moves even further away from the Eliza Labber style of character. He's exceptionally simple, one of the simplest characters in the game. He doesn't really use that many moves, and you're certainly not going to be getting matchup checked by him like you would with a million other Tekken 7 characters. So what's the problem then? Well, Noctis is the first character so far who truly fits into the second pay-to-win archetype of Tekken 7 we're going to talk about, the modern Tekken character. You see, Tekken 6, despite being a pretty well-balanced game in my opinion, started introducing us to what the community calls modern Tekken. These are S-tier characters who are exceptionally simple. Anyone can pick them up very easily and immediately be effective. Because rather than using a collection of a ton of different moves for super different circumstances, they use a small amount of ridiculously overtuned moves that just have everything. Lars and Bob were big examples of this, and dominated competitive play in both Tekken 6 and in Tekken Tag 2. Tekken 7 did well to tone down the two biggest problem children, which in many's eyes represented everything wrong with modern Tekken games. While yes, there were undoubtedly balancing problems in early Tekken 7, at least the majority of top tiers took some level of work to use, and were not nearly as unbelievably simple as these two. There were certainly outliers in the base roster, I'm looking at you, Claudio, but generally it was a big improvement. Until the DLC. Again, I've already talked about Noctis in length in the other video, but basically, he played Tekken. He wasn't playing Street Fighter like these guys, but it was unbelievably privileged Tekken, having access to some of the most oppressive, all-serving moves we've ever seen. Anyone could pick him up and instantly be effective with him. The amount of value you could get on this character relative to the amount of effort was an absolute joke, and was what started a pretty nasty trend in this game's DLC, with characters who, even when they weren't the strongest, would be so ridiculously easy for the amount of output you could get out of them that it was kind of a joke. While Noctis didn't have 2D mechanics, he introduced a lot of stuff to the series that was completely new. We had never seen range like this guy, with his various massive disjointed hitboxes, a full-screen projectile approach, this cancer, being able to 50-50 you from 6 meters away. A character with tools like this simply was not available in the base roster. The only way to play a character with this kind of privilege was to open up your wallet and pull out your credit card. Keep this idea of modern Tekken characters in the back of your mind, because Noctis is going to look like children's play compared to some of what we'll see later. Our next three characters are all very similar, so I'm going to talk about all three of them at once. These were our first legacy characters who returned to the series. Something you'll notice about Tekken 7's DLC is that every single new character introduced to the series ended up being extremely overtuned in some way, having access to new tools to Tekken that we had never seen in the series before. Even if they weren't necessarily broken, they were offering brand new privilege that you couldn't get anywhere else. I'm really not exaggerating here. There are quite literally no exceptions to this, and you'll notice that throughout the video. The legacy characters that returned were treated a lot more fairly, and were generally much better examples of how to implement DLC. That's not to say there were no issues though. Anna Williams, Lei Wulong, and Craig Marduk. You guys already know exactly what I'm gonna say here. Yes, these are classic characters, and yes, they absolutely belong in Tekken. However, just to make my argument for a second, if you want to talk about the most matchup checky, gimmicky, lab me or auto lose archetype in Tekken history, all three of these characters would be ranked pretty highly on the list. Anna in Tekken 7 is nothing compared to how broken she is today in Tekken 8. She was actually one of the most balanced characters in this game, definitely being weaker than average because of how risky she had to play if she wanted to utilize the character's 50-50. Certainly not a pay-to-win DLC character by her strength. But even in Tekken 7, she was exceptionally gimmicky, a lot more so than the average character, adding at least a little bit to the labber archetype. Nothing too crazy, but you would absolutely be at a disadvantage if you weren't able to lab the character because you didn't own her. Whatever, not a huge problem. Anna, however, couldn't compare to Lei. Oh my god, Lei. If I'm being honest, I actually do like Lei as a character in general, and I think he's an important part of the Tekken series. But let me just say this. Those of you who joined the series in Tekken 8 have no idea how lucky you are that you never had to fight this guy. Lei is one of the most gimmicky and confusing characters to fight in Tekken history. Maybe the most gimmicky, to be honest. His whole kit is built around setups after setups, constant tricks, constant string spam, and of course, the stances. Lei Wulong has the most stances out of any character in Tekken history. He technically has 13 different stances. You didn't just hear me wrong, I said 13. Potentially the most complicated character to lab in the game, and the one where, more so than anyone else we've talked about so far, you have to lab him if you want to beat him. It is not optional. And if you thought you could avoid buying him and just learn through playing him online, good luck with that. He's the 7th least played character in the game, and considering there's 51 characters in Tekken 7, this means you'll see him maybe once a month, maybe less. If you were lucky, you would occasionally run into one who would be willing to do the deathmatch and keep rematching so you could take in as much information as possible. But it almost doesn't even matter because anything you do learn will most certainly be forgotten by the next month when you next see the character. It's hard to explain to people who don't know Lei, but he is like a different kind of cancer to fight against. It's just so much constant pressure, setup into setup into setup. Just like Anna though, he wasn't particularly strong, usually being put in the lower mid-tier in most tier lists, but this just doesn't really matter for 99.9% of the player base. Even in tournament play, unless you're in the top 10 or 20 players in the world, you can get a lot of success playing characters like this and just matchup checking your way to big wins and upsets. We've seen it time after time in Tekken's competitive lifetime. Lei is arguably the most lab-type character we've ever seen in Tekken. Insanely complicated, 174 moves, and it's just like, wow. If you don't want to shell out the money to be able to understand him, good luck. It's just not really doable. Unless, again, you want to dedicate a ridiculous amount of time going through character discords, finding multiple Lei players who hopefully are nice enough to be willing to play with you on a consistent basis. But even then, it's not the same as being able to quickly test stuff out for yourself and see what works. You'll always be at a disadvantage to people who own the character, who can just see something quickly and then swap to Lei in training mode and test it out as much as they want. Are Lei players at an inherent advantage in almost every level of play because of the characters they bought? In a lot of ways, yeah, for sure. I could definitely see someone making that argument, despite his placement on the tier list. But oh my god, does it somehow not even compare to Craig Marduk. Revealed at the 2018 Tekken World Finals in Amsterdam, Marduk was when a lot more people started to take issue with the DLC selection so far. Ignoring the fact that Anna, Lei, and Marduk were all legacy characters who were free in the previous Tekken games and now being sold back to us, these were a collection of some of the most generally hated characters in the series. Hated to fight, that is, because all three of them were definitely lots of fun to play. Marduk in Tekken 7 is one of the cheapest top tiers in the game. And notice, I did say top tier. He was incredibly strong, and if we're being honest, was pure cheese. Even Marduk players would admit they were able to get tons of wins simply because of the character. Marduk as a character revolved around his tackle, where he would constantly force these annoying three-way mix-ups. You could break the tackle, but if he spaced it properly, it was essentially frame perfect. Even pro players like Arslan Ash would fail to break this tackle all the time in pro play. So it definitely wasn't just a gimmick. He would do this tackle in neutral, but it would mostly be right after knockdowns to catch people tech rolling, or honestly trying to get up in any way at all. And when his opponents decided not to get up, he would threaten a launching ground throw, and another ground throw with a different throw break. Breaking throws is hard enough for the average player, but being ready to break throws while you're on the ground and reacting to the hand is very difficult. If he didn't want to do a throw, he'd threaten a ton of other insanely strong options to flip you around and reset the situation. His Oki was amazing. Marduk also had stupidly high damage, DLC damage if you will, even having some death combos. He had a million setups at the wall, giving him guaranteed tackle attempts, and he would threaten throws to reset the whole situation and flip you over for another combo. And we haven't even mentioned how tricky of a character he was. There are plenty of gimmicks on Marduk, don't you worry. So many different ways to go into tackle, transitioning from many moves, and lots of stuff you've likely just never seen before. His rage drive was also one of the absolute best in Tekken. No other character has a rage drive even remotely like this. This is definitely some DLC privilege, doing ludicrous unscaled damage if you ended your combo with it, and forcing another mix-up before you can even get up. So fun to deal with, guys. When you hear legacy players saying they don't want Marduk back, this is why. So here we have a top tier, but not just any top tier, one of the most frustrating to fight in the game, at least according to the vast majority of pro players and community members. An argument could absolutely be made that this is a pay-to-win character. You're getting an insane amount of privilege on Marduk. even though he had plenty of defined weaknesses, mainly with his lack of safety. I'm not necessarily ready to say that any of the characters we've gone over so far are objectively pay to win. I'm just getting the thought in your mind as we go through more characters and start to get to some of the real issues. The next DLC character was Armor King, the king himself, and in my opinion was actually one of the most fair and well-designed characters in all of the DLC. He was nerfed significantly from Tag 2 and Tekken 6, landing in the mid-tier, but was given a lot of love in places he needed, and the redesign was just perfect. Armor King was a pretty simple brawler-grappler hybrid, so not a ton of matchup checks in my opinion, though I know there's plenty of people watching who heard me say grappler and immediately disagreed. The thing about Armor King though is, firstly, he was incredibly popular, being the 4th most played character by the end of the game's lifetime. This is super important to note, as you could learn the matchup like 20 times faster than say Anna, Lei, or Eliza. Like I said earlier, he also wasn't really generally built like a lab character. He doesn't rely on a ton of strings or stances, so his potential to matchup check isn't super high. Besides the throws, which, even if you don't have the character, you could always lab throw breaks and improve your own personal ability. And as for the chain throws, okay, you got me. You'd probably want to lab them to get comfortable recognizing the animation. If you really want to make the argument, you could say that Armor King is similar to the other legacy characters. After Armor King, we got Julia, and just about every issue we've talked about so far in this video absolutely applies here. She was a top 5 character, one of the absolute strongest and most overtuned characters in the game. Julia arguably had the strongest neutral tools we had ever seen in Tekken, but instead of just being built around that, she was also insanely gimmicky, having some of the most string extensions out of any character in the game. Every move had a hidden follow-up, and Julia players would play around all of these mix-ups, praying that you had never seen them before. In terms of the neutral, she gets the best neutral move in Tekken 7, Party Crasher, or Forward Forward 1, coming out at a ridiculous 12 frames and being a fully tracking elbow, meaning you can't parry it, and a measly -2 on block. It also, of course, had a high follow-up that counter-hit launched. This move might not seem like much looking at it, but having an approaching poke tool that has this many properties is ridiculously strong in competitive play, and is definitely DLC privilege. No one else had something like this. She'd mix this up with her Forward Forward 1+2, a 14-frame safe on block mid with big pushback on block, and it wall bounced. Yes, wall bounce was a mechanic in this game, and this was largely considered the best wall bounce attack in the entire game. Another great approaching tool was her while running 1, which was a ridiculously fast move and was +4 on block, and did around 50 damage on hit because of her guaranteed follow-ups. Just some of the absolute best rushdown tools out of any top tier. She was able to control space like no one else. And if it was just that, we probably wouldn't be holding her in such high regard. Unfortunately, there's a lot more. She also was up there with Geese, having some of the best wall travel in the game, and the highest damaging wall combo, doing 34 damage. She had stupid properties on generic moves, like her down forward 1, which was +14 if it caught you crouching, allowing her to get a 60 damage follow-up and a wall splat, all while being completely safe. She had one of the best 50-50s in the game, with her bow and arrow low, that for some godforsaken reason didn't stagger on block, and would lead to some borderline unfair Oki. Her classic war drums low was a setup machine, especially at the wall. And let me ask you something. Are you beating this character without being able to lab her? You aren't even beating this character if you did lab her. Just a stupidly overtuned DLC character. Julia brings up a much better argument for pay to win. Although I'm still not necessarily ready to say that she objectively is. If you wanted to play a better character, Akuma was in the base roster and was far more rule breaking. In addition to this, I wouldn't exactly call Julia easy. She had tons of execution and setups you need to spend lots of time labbing to fully understand it. She definitely had the DLC lab character advantage, but this character is still not the worst of it yet. Hopefully you're starting to see a pattern though. Our 9th DLC character was Negan himself from The Walking Dead. One of the coolest inclusions in any fighting game if you ask me. Such a cool guest character, representing the awesome villains theme of Tekken 7. Unfortunately, however, Negan was strikingly similar to Noctis, our last guest character. He was designed around being exceptionally easy, a level of ease that just wasn't really seen amongst the base roster. What you got out of him for the effort you had to put in was kind of a complete joke. Negan, despite not being a top tier, almost feels like a prototype for a Tekken 8 character. He had such insanely streamlined options. First off, just like Noctis, he's a weapon character, so you get crazy range and disjointed hitboxes. Okay, nice. Also, just like Noctis, you get some of the easiest combos we've ever seen in Tekken history, having great wall travel and damage with virtually zero execution. He has great block and whiff punishing tools, great long-range counter hits, and tons of safe normal hit launchers, strikingly similar to Noctis. But Negan also had a mid-power crush launcher. You know power crushes, right? That mechanic introduced in this game that almost no one in the Tekken community likes, the one that people still complain about daily in Tekken 8? Well, Negan got a Power Crush normal hit launcher, which was essentially a completely unique mechanic to him, as the other characters who had tools like this, like Hwoarang's Backlash for example, were either highs that could be ducked or evaded through high crush moves, moves that were locked behind stances, or moves with terrible range like Lily's. Negan gets a huge range normal hit mid Power Crush. Not cool. It was -15, which is somewhat fair, but there was also quite a few characters in this game who couldn't launch it, much more than in Tekken 8 today. And some of the other moves that are similar like this, like the Lily one I mentioned, would be -17. It's still pretty damn privileged. Negan also had the Intimidation stance, which has a striking resemblance to some of the new stances we've started to see in Tekken 8. He can move around freely during it, and guess what? Will automatically parry all lows. Sound like modern Tekken? They would give a full launch if they used any low. Yes, a full launch. This stance also had tons of super easy and oppressive moves, like a +7 on block mid that does 40 damage on regular hit, a safe 26 damage low that is of course completely impossible to low parry because he has a weapon. Welcome to DLC privilege. Of course, he had plenty of other attacks and strings that lead into each other, take him in and out of stances, keep him in stance, very Tekken 8-esque. He has an unbreakable throw that wall splats, and lots of other tricks and gimmicky utility to matchup check your opponents. If you want to play poking, he also gets some very simple and effective pokes, like his 1-2 string that has a mid follow-up that's +4 on block and normal hit launches. Okay, that's a new one. And did we mention the range on this guy's attacks? What are we doing here? Negan, just like Noctis, is very clearly a DLC character. For the money, you're getting a character unlike anything else in Tekken, who, for the tools he offers, is one of the best time values you can get. I cannot overstate how easy of a character he was to pick up and play. And even still, this guy somehow wouldn't compare to what we're rapidly heading towards. Negan wrapped up Season 2, and the Season 3 DLC characters began to flood in the coming year. We unfortunately at this time had no idea what was waiting for us. We had no idea that this next season pass would lead to one of the worst competitive metas in Tekken history. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The third season pass opened with Zafina, and let's just say it was not a great start to what would be the most controversial and problematic DLC pack, not only in Tekken history, but arguably in all of fighting game history. Zafina's an interesting one because she mixes in everything we've talked about in the Labber archetype, having tons of stances, evasion on everything, a million strings and setups, really as much as you can get in a character in Tekken. You'd have essentially no chance at beating her unless you spent a pretty insane amount of time labbing all of her various stances and transitions. But she also mixed that in with modern Tekken options, some of the best fundamental tools in the game, making her a tournament favorite, used of course by Arslan Ash for a large chunk of the game's life. If you bought this character, firstly, you were getting the best movement in Tekken 7. She would be later dethroned by a certain other DLC character, but at the time, this was the best Tekken 7 had to offer, which is naturally a pretty insanely important attribute in a 3D fighting game that revolves around movements. She could sidestep and backdash sequences that no other character in the game could. There were tons of strings that she was just able to get out of. And if you want to talk about DLC privilege, this is a pretty broken example of it. You are quite literally paying for a character who can move in a way that no one else can. But it wasn't just the movements. She was also one of the most evasive characters in the game, with her stances and some of her core moves not only crushing highs, but also evading mids. Super annoying and very strong in a tournament setting. Of course, as I mentioned, the character would also play around her incredibly strong fundamental tools. Forward Forward 4 is a full screen range homing mid that's safe on block and knocks down on regular hits. It also wall splats. Her Forward Forward 1 is a high that's +1 on block, homing, and a counter hit launcher. These two moves alone allow her to shut down sidestepping extremely effectively. She almost feels like a Tekken 8 character. And that, combined with how she can lock you down with her insane plus on block normals, like her forward 3, which has big range and is a +4 on block mid, taking her into a scarecrow stance for a 50-50. And speaking of Tekken 8, we have stances. Don't even get me started on her stances. Some of the most annoying and cheesy setups and mix-ups in Tekken history come from her stances, making her the pinnacle of being a labber archetype. Out of her Mantis stance, she had a ridiculous safe on block low that counter hit launched. You heard me right, her Mantis down 3-1 is a low mid, and even if you block the first low, it ends with a mid that leaves her -9 in stance. And again, this fully counter hit launches. If you want pure gimmicky utility, she also had her back 3, which was a safe mid power crush. One of the only neutral stance safe mid power crushes in Tekken history. And it's just like, okay, I guess this is what female DLC characters are now. Zafina did have some weaknesses, like not having a 15-frame standing launcher, and having pretty average combo damage, but the package you were getting for the money was pretty ridiculous. Alright, it's time for the next character. And this next character is pretty significant, as this was the last balanced DLC character we would ever get in Tekken 7. After this, it was pure pay to win for the entire rest of the game's lifetime. The next character was good old Ganryu. Not a ton to say here. Everything we've mentioned throughout this video about the labber type character applies here. He was reasonably well balanced, again fitting with the theme of legacy characters having significantly less privilege than the newcomers. But even still, Ganryu has always been a cheese monster. Let's just be real for a second, okay? This is the king of back turn, the king of stances and 50-50s. He has evasion up the ass, unblockables, and yes, strings. So many strings. Once Ganryu gets started, he never stops. And let's take a look at his play rates. Oh boy, the 4th least played character in the game. I hope you bought the character, or at least had a friend who could sit you down for hours explaining this complicated character, because otherwise, you're simply not gonna beat him. Being real for a second though, we can't be too mad at mid-tier Ganryu, because the next character we received was Leroy Smith. You guys already know about Leroy. You know how he was the most broken character in Tekken history on launch. You know he was a character who was so incredibly oppressive that 6 of the players out of the top 8 at EVO Japan 2020 were using this character. Leroy's first appearance here in the DLC is so infamous that I've actually seen a ton of commenters over the years say they only knew about Tekken 7 because of Leroy. That's how huge his impact was. Leroy took every issue people had with Bob and Lars in Tekken 6 and Tekken Tag 2 and amplified them heavily. These issues being that they required all of one brain cell to pick up and play effectively, and were better than every other character in every possible attribute. And I really mean it. Every single thing you could want in a Tekken character, Leroy had, and was better than your main at it. Best poking in the game with his insane down forward 1 and 1-1 jab string that allowed him to visually confirm a counter hit and wall splat for like 80 damage. A safe mid-mid poke string that is a counter hit launcher. Okay, we're really giving characters a move like that? A 21 frame orbital, significantly faster than every other orbital in the game, that hits grounded? Why does it need to hit grounded? What other character has something like that? A 12-frame counter-hit launcher, safe on block, huge range, and almost electric-like knockback on block. The best approach tools in the game, forward 3, a plus on block homing approach tool that is a normal hit launcher. Down 1+2 was a huge range, neutral on block counter-hit launcher that forced crouch. It was neutral on block. It's like someone played Tekken 6 and saw Bob and took his down 1, one of the best moves in the game, and said, what if it was a counter hit launcher? We're moving backwards here, not forwards. He of course had one of the longest range hell sweeps in the game that was homing. Who gets tools like this? No other character in Tekken 7 had even remotely similar moves to this. He also had some of the highest combo damage in the game, Devil Jin type damage, with 0, and I mean 0 of the execution. You could learn his highest damaging combos in like 30 minutes. If you were looking for a weakness, you were looking at the wrong character, because there was nothing, and I really mean it, not one single weakness to be found here. Any playstyle you wanted to approach the game with, he was probably your best option at it, be it poking, counter hits, stance rushdown, full screen 50-50s, anything. He was so oppressive that if you didn't pay for the character, you would actively be putting yourself at a major disadvantage in competitive play. I've talked about it a lot on my channel, but ease of use on a character is super important in competitive play. There's a reason why most pros today aren't using hyper-specialized characters. It's just a crazy burden on top players, having to not only fight against their opponents, who are world-class players, but also be fighting against their own character. Generally, in tournament play, easy is always better. There's enough to worry about in the tournament set without having to worry about dropping execution or things just not working properly. Anything like that you want to avoid as a pro player. And as such, Leroy was naturally a god-given gift to anyone who played in tournaments, and we saw that very clearly in his player rates. He quickly became the most played character in tournaments, and one of the most played characters online as well. An absolute nightmare, and the best example of a true pay-to-win character we had ever seen at that point. I don't know how anyone could argue against this. If you bought Leroy, you were objectively at an advantage over anyone else who wasn't playing the character, in pretty much every way. No one else got to do what base Leroy could do. Not even close. The Leroy fiasco severely hurt the competitive reputation of Tekken 7, even after the character's many nerfs. And with all the horrible press and backlash surrounding the character, you'd think Namco would have learned their lesson, and learned that maybe it's not a good idea to release their DLC characters in this state. Unfortunately, not only did they not learn their lesson, they doubled down. The next character was Fahkumram, and quite literally, every single problem with Leroy was present in Fahkumram. Everything. Once again, another DLC character with zero weakness, the best at every possible Tekken attribute, and of course, one of the easiest characters we had ever seen in Tekken. People were so fed up that Fahkumram was actually banned in Pakistan, and a huge amount of people opted to quit the game entirely. Fahkumram was a joke, an absolute joke. For the low price of $6, you were getting a character who isn't even playing Tekken 7. He's playing Tekken 5. At launch, Fahkumram had the best movement in the entire game. Movement that was such a departure from standard Tekken 7 gameplay that people joked and said he was playing Tag 2 or Tekken 5, and they weren't wrong at all. Why is the biggest character in the game able to move around like this? His movement was even better than Zafina. So now we're at a point where if you want to play the two characters who have movement that's far better than anyone in the main roster, you have to pay money. Sounds pretty pay to win to me. And if the movement alone wasn't enough, he also had some of the best reach in the game. He rivaled Noctis, a sword character, with how far some of his kicks reached. You'd have to be around 4 to 5 backdashes away from him to avoid most of his stuff. He had the longest range down forward 1 in the game, a down forward 1 that forced like a 7-way mix-up, and he didn't even need to use this down forward 1 because his standing 3 was a full screen 13-frame mid-poke that also forced a mix-up on block. He had the most ridiculous guard breaks and guard break setups we had ever seen at this point in time, honestly rivaling some of Tekken 8's guard breaks. Did this really need a wall splat? He also had 1,000,000+ on block attacks, you couldn't sidestep him because everything tracked, he had the best combo damage in the game, with a Marduk style rage drive for ending combos, giving him like 130 damage from a safe counter hit launcher. He had a bug throw that was incredibly difficult to break, having the same break window as Tekken Tag 2, and of course this throw needed to wall splat for like 90 damage. He was just everything wrong with modern Tekken, boiled down into one character. Launch Fahkumram and Leroy were by far the two most pay-to-win characters in Tekken DLC history, and still to this day set a very scary precedent for what DLC could be. Season 4 of Tekken 7 introduced two final DLC characters, Kunimitsu and Lydia, and both of these characters unfortunately only served to add more salt to the wound that Leroy and Fahkumram created. At this point, both the previously mentioned characters had been nerfed pretty significantly, but Namco still hadn't learned their lesson, and shipped out these two waifus in broken states. Kunimitsu was exceptionally strong, and of course one of the easiest characters in the game, having incredibly streamlined offense, and an actual one-button mash viable option. Her infamous 2-2-2 string would force your opponent to take a mix-up, no matter how good of a player they were. Why? Why is this a thing? Of course, just like Zafina and Fahkumram before his nerf, Kunimitsu also had ridiculously broken movements, the best backdash and sidestep in the game. And come on, if one DLC character gets the best movement, we could call it a coincidence. 2 DLC characters? I don't really know anymore, but 3? Come on. This is absolutely ridiculous and is borderline predatory. Kuni moves like a Tekken 5 character, and combined with her tiny size and non-existent hurtbox, makes her one of the hardest characters to hit in the game. Of course, if all she had was unfair movement, it wouldn't be nearly as much of a problem, but she of course had to follow the modern Tekken weapon archetype philosophy. She has a projectile, just like Noctis, except hers is even faster, an instant knife throw that can whiff punish from full screen in half a second. It honestly kind of reminds me of the Season 4 Ryu Laser Beam level 1, if any of you guys play Street Fighter. Despite the dagger actually being -11 on block, having a move like this means she's always conditioning your opponent, and you always wanted to move around less when fighting her because you were looking to block it and get the -11 punish. Kunimitsu also had one of, if not the best stances in the game. Once again, a stance that is very reminiscent of Tekken 8 characters, Clive specifically. Her forward 3 has her instantly dash in at her opponent, giving her a super easy and streamlined way of approaching. And this of course needed to come packaged in with a 12-frame safe on block mid that counter hit launches. 12 frames fast. Wow. She also had a low that, you guessed it, counter hit launches and evades all highs. This is starting to feel very familiar. This stance is also significantly faster than anything else like it at the time, meaning reacting to it was very difficult. From this stance, she could also do strings that teleport her into the air, strings that teleport her backwards, she could flip jump, she can go into full crouch for her amazing crouch mix-ups, she can go into back turn, and it's like, is this enough mix-up options from one single stance? Have we had enough yet? She is a god when she's far away, but as soon as she closes in, she's also a god, having all of the broken streamlined DLC attacks that you paid for. A huge range hop kick, a huge range weapon down forward 2, a 14-frame launcher, all the range you could want. Her poking was also arguably the best in the game, with her 1-1 being a high mid that's -5 on block, and can go into a million follow-ups, including a classic fully evasive backswing blow that's safe on block, a teleport, she can do another high. Like, come on, this is too much. All of this naturally added up to her being one of the most gimmicky and cheesy characters in the game, one that you absolutely had to lab if you wanted to beat. So take out your credit cards, boys. We haven't even gotten to her most egregious attack yet, the infamous 2-2 we talked about earlier. Her 2-2 alone is arguably the best string in the game, a 12-frame high mid that's safe on block and tracks to her weak side. You can decide to keep mashing 2 for extra high hits, and the whole thing is for some reason natural on counter hits, meaning if they try and interrupt you or think you'll end the string early, they'll take a ton of damage. The highs also come out so fast that if you duck and try to launch, you'll also get hit by the string. For even more mix-up potential, you could end the string with a mid. You could also cancel that mid. You could also cancel the second hit into her stance, where she flies up into the air. If your opponent presses any kind of mid, you could immediately use your evasive launcher to steal their turn and get a full combo. She's essentially able to force almost a 5-way mix-up every time she mashes the 2 button. Welcome to Tekken 7 Modern DLC. Of course, she also had good combo damage as well. She wasn't as egregious as Leroy and Fahkumram, but come on, this is still an absolute joke. I'm exhausted talking about these DLC characters, and we still have one more character to talk about. Lydia was the final character added to Tekken 7, a character that was added while the development team were working on Tekken 8. And it really shows. She was basically a Tekken 8 character beta, and before her huge nerfs, many Korean players including me claimed she was the best character in the game. Lydia just had it all. Tekken 8 style stance rushdown, being able to shift from one stance to another very quickly. And she could force all kinds of extremely frustrating 50-50s, while also having great neutral tools, like her old pre-nerf Political Storm, which had monstrous range and forced a mind game on block. Each hit could be cancelled, only leaving her at -10, but just like Brian's down forward 1, it wasn't reactable, so you would have to hard predict that she would stop halfway through if you wanted to try and punish it. If you guessed wrong, however, she would easily hit confirm the rest of the string. The string also tracked to both sides, and speaking of tracking, here's another Tekken 8 attribute that she had. Everything tracked. Sidestepping her was nearly impossible, meaning she could keep you glued down, which was exactly what she wanted to mix you up. She had a crazy range 16-frame hell sweep, big damage, and oh, have I mentioned stance rushdown yet? Because that is Lydia. So, was Tekken 7 pay to win? Yeah, for sure it was. Out of all the DLC characters that we talked about today, 11 of the 15 are at the very least somewhat problematic. And that's me being pretty generous. Every brand new character had some pay-to-win traits, and the game ended on a terrible note, with the last 4 characters all being OP top tiers. The DLC was just too much in Tekken 7. I don't think you can argue against this. This was not a great start for the first ever Tekken game to have paid DLC. Overpowered DLC characters like this are a problem that's just all too common these days in fighting games, and have significantly worsened the competitive state of tons of different games. This is something you should absolutely want to avoid in your fighting games. Although, I seriously doubt it's ever going to stop. Developers know all too well that releasing characters like this greatly increases sales, and therefore the profit they make on these games, while also drawing in a ton of new eyes, even if it's not necessarily for a positive reason. The DLC in Tekken 8 actually had a really good start, with Eddie, Lydia, and Heihachi all being pretty well balanced. After that, however, we got Clive and Anna, who reminded us all of the horrors of Tekken 7. The most recent character, Fahkumram, was like the first three, a very well-balanced character with defined strengths and weaknesses, so I honestly have no idea where we'll go from here. Here's hoping Armor King and the next characters are not broken and are well-balanced, fun DLC characters. Anyway, that's about all I've got for this video. If you guys enjoyed and want to support me, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, or leaving a comment. It's a really big help as these videos take a ton of work to get done. Thanks again for watching. Big shout out to all my YouTube members. I could not do this without you guys. Also, quickly while I have you guys here, I wanted to just say in a video that I am officially back to streaming. I am streaming here on this channel on YouTube, starting at around 4 to 5 p.m. EST every weekday. So if you guys are interested in seeing me lose my mind in Tekken, make sure to come through to the streams. I'd love to see you guys there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.